Hello everyone, I'm Pete from Deeper Roots Coffee, and we're back with some more wholesale educational content. Today we're going to be covering brewing principles and theory. Within that subject, there are a few key concepts that when put into practice will help you brew better coffee. The first concepts to understand are the concepts of extraction and strength. Now, in coffee, extraction can mean a lot of different things, but for our purposes today, we're going to be using that word to describe the act of pulling out flavor and aromatic compounds from the coffee, as well as describing the flavor of that coffee. We like to look at extraction on a spectrum. On one end of that spectrum, you have under extraction, and on the other end of that spectrum, you have over extraction. Somewhere in the middle, we'll find that ideal extraction, but each ends of that spectrum have negative flavor characteristics associated with them. Under-extracted coffees typically are going to express themselves as being overwhelmingly sour, whereas over-extracted coffees typically will express themselves as having an overwhelming bitterness to them. So ideally, we're on neither end of that spectrum, and our brews are landing right in the middle at the sweet spot, where we have a nice, sweet, round, and balanced brew. Strength refers to the mouthfeel, the texture, or the body of a coffee, the tactile experience of the brew. A lot of people like to describe the coffee that they enjoy as being strong, but today, for our purposes, strength simply refers to the ratio of coffee to water. How strong are we brewing our coffee? Our objective when brewing coffee is to find a balance between extraction and strength. Is our extraction ideal and avoiding the negative flavor characteristics associated with under and over extraction? And are we achieving the appropriate and intended strength of our brew? It's important to note the 4 characteristics that we're looking for in a quality brew of coffee. Those are clarity, complexity, balance, and sweetness. Clarity. Does our coffee have transparent flavors? Can we pick up specific flavor notes? Complexity. Are there many flavors in our coffee? Balance. Are the many flavors that we're picking up clearly in balance with each other? And sweetness. Does our brew have a natural and inherent sweetness about it? All right, now that we know what the objective is, let's talk about how we go about achieving that. And that is through the manipulation of 8 basic brewing variables. Of these 8 brewing variables, some of them the barista is going to have to pay a little bit more attention to throughout the day, whereas some are a little bit more controlled, but they still have a great effect on the extraction and the strength of our coffee. These variables apply to all coffee brewing, whether it's espresso, pour over, cold brew, however you're brewing coffee, these variables can be applied and manipulated in a way to achieve that perfect extraction and that ideal strength that we're looking for. The first variable might seem kind of obvious, but we thought that it was a good idea to include it, and that is the coffee. The coffee itself. It's important to know all of the details about the coffee itself so that when you're brewing, you can pull out the flavors and the qualities and the characteristics that you're looking for in that coffee. So some things to consider about the coffee are, what do you know about this coffee's origin? Where was it grown? How was it processed? What do you know about how it was roasted? The roast level or the roast profile? And then maybe most importantly, when was this coffee roasted? How many days off of roast has it rested? Because that will influence your approach to brewing the coffee. Up next is water quality. Now this variable is not necessarily something that you as the barista are going to monitor too heavily, but knowing how it affects our brew is very important. Brewed coffee is about 98% water, so the quality of that water is very important. Most coffee shops are going to be set up with the appropriate water filtration to ensure that the water is free of any taste or odors and that it's at the appropriate hardness. Our water does need to have some mineral content in order to pull flavors out of coffee. If you've ever brewed coffee with distilled water, you'll notice that there's pretty much no flavor at all in those coffees. That's because there's nothing in the water itself. So brewing with water that's at the appropriate specifications is very important for the quality of our brews. Next is coffee filter media. Now this is basically a reference to how we're choosing to brew our coffee. Are we using a paper filter? Are we using a metal filter? Are we maybe using no filter at all? Knowing how we're brewing our coffee will affect the way that the coffee tastes as well as feels. is a very important thing to consider. We may need to adjust other variables to accommodate for that brewing method or the filter media itself. Being familiar with your coffee filter media can inform you on how to adjust the other brewing variables to achieve ideal extraction and ideal strength. The next variable we're going to talk about is grind size. Now this variable is one that I think that the barista has the most control over, and it is the most influential over the coffee's extraction or flavor. Grind size is important for two reasons. The first reason is that it controls the flow rate of water through the coffee bed. My favorite analogy to describe why grind size is important in the way that it controls the flow of water through our coffee is to imagine two jars. One jar is full of sand and one jar is full of gravel. If you pass water through both of those, it's going to fly right through the gravel, and it's going to take a very long time to pass through the sand. This is the same thing that happens with coffee that's ground very coarse versus very, very fine. So we're controlling how much time the water is in contact with our coffee, therefore controlling how much extraction we're getting from the coffee. The second reason that grind size is so important is the finer that we grind our coffee, the more surface area on each coffee particle we have for water to enter into the coffee particles and pull out flavor and aromatic compounds. So a finer grind generally will give us higher extractions. But remember, you can also have too high of extraction leading to negative flavor characteristics. Grind size is a variable that the barista is going to have to monitor throughout the day and definitely from day to day, especially when we're working with espresso. Espresso is a bit volatile and can change throughout the day depending on environmental factors, among other things. But this is a variable that the barista has a lot of control over and can use that to achieve the right extraction for the drinks that they're serving. The next brewing variable to cover is brewing ratio. Now, brewing ratio refers to the amount of coffee to the amount of water that we're using. And although this may have a small effect on the extraction of our coffee, it's going to have the most effect on the strength of our coffee. And remember, the strength of our coffee really just refers to the mouthfeel or the body or the tactile experience of our coffee. The best way to understand this more fully is to compare the way that espresso feels and the body of espresso to the way that filter coffee feels or the tactile experience of filter coffee. Espresso typically is brewed to a ratio of 1 part coffee to 2 parts water, whereas filter coffee is closer to 1 part coffee to 15 parts water. Clearly, there's a big difference in the body and the mouthfeel between espresso and filter coffee, and that's primarily and really exclusively due to the ratio that we're brewing that coffee at. So if we need to adjust the strength of our brew, it's very easy to do. We can either add a little bit more coffee or we can use a little bit less water. And conversely, if we want our brew to be slightly weaker, all we have to do is use a little bit less coffee or use a little bit more water. Adjusting that brewing ratio can help you achieve the strength and the body that you're looking for with your brew. Pressure. Espresso. It's there. There's a pump. It adds the pressure. But all coffee pressure has. All right. The next brewing variable is pressure. And although pressure is specific to espresso, it does exist in all coffee brewing. Pressure is not necessarily a variable that you as the barista are going to be controlling. The applications under which pressure is applied, such as espresso, the machines you're using are going to be applying that pressure in a very consistent way from shot to shot. However, pressure does contribute to the extraction of our espresso as well as the strength and mouthfeel and the body that we're looking for with espresso. Our next brewing variable that can have a pretty significant effect on the extraction of our coffee is water temperature. Generally, the higher the temperature of our water, the more extraction we're going to get. As water heats up, those water molecules become more active and can more efficiently pull flavors and aromas out of coffee. The best example of how water temperature affects our extraction is the difference between hot brewed coffee and cold brewed coffee. Hot brewed coffee can reach the ideal extraction in just a few minutes, whereas cold brewed coffee can take many hours to do the same. This can be directly attributed to the temperature of the water that we're using to brew. It's also important to note that there are certain qualities that hot water extracts from coffee that cold water does not. Generally, this is a variable that the barista won't have to monitor too much unless we're using an electric kettle where we're setting the temperature to brew our coffee. But you should know that the water temperature range for a typical hot brewed coffee is somewhere between 195 and 205 degrees. The last brewing variable to consider is extraction time. Now, in some situations, you can have a direct control over the extraction time, but usually it's going to be the result of the manipulation of our other brewing variables that we've already talked about. For example, if you make your grind much finer, you're going to slow the flow rate of water through the coffee, thus increasing your extraction. Typically, a brewing method will have a recommended extraction time, so extraction time can be a really useful tool or metric when it comes to gauging the extraction level of our coffee. Using Alchemy Espresso as an example, we know that the best tasting shots typically fall between 25 and 30 seconds. So if your shots are falling outside of that range, you can manipulate the other brewing variables to achieve a shot time between 25 and 30 seconds. As a barista, the best tool at your disposal is your palate. So tasting coffee as you're brewing, especially when you're dialing in an espresso, can be very helpful when it comes to navigating these variables. Understanding these concepts in theory is one thing, but putting them into practice is the best way to fully understand how manipulating our brewing variables affects the flavor of our coffees. Taste more coffee. Taste it. Just brew a coffee, change a variable, taste it again. Change your grind, taste it. Use more coffee, taste it. Drop your water temperature, taste it. You'll get it. You'll get it in no time. At the end of the day, you should just be experimenting with coffee. It should be fun. The fun never stops.